together some Lenten worship kits for each of your families, and they can be picked up starting this Sunday, I believe it is. Kalissa's been working on them, and we've actually taken, interestingly, we have, every year when we do the candle lighting services here on Christmas Eve, except for this past year, of course, we always have candles left over. They burn for just a short amount of time, and being good Dunwoody folks, we tend to like new candles. And so we have had these candles kind of in reserve. And so Kalissa has taken all the candles that we had, or most of them from Christmas Eve in past years, and have melted them down to create new votive candles that you can use for your Lent celebration and worship in your home. And so there'll even be a small container of ashes for you to impose Ash Wednesday ashes upon your family's head. And so that'll be this part of that kit too. So we're excited about it. And, it's obviously not going to be the same as being here, but it's a wonderful thing to do. And then the prayer triads also are something we'd like to encourage you to do. Kathy Brockman is pairing or putting groups into threes, and beginning the week after Ash Wednesday or begins the season of Lent, you'll have a chance to develop this relationship on a once a week basis with your prayer partners, and to share with them your concerns and thoughts, but also to do some sermon dialogue from the previous sermon, and then do that. So there's a lot of stuff coming on. We also have our annual Lenten devotional that Ann West has put together for us this year. Many of our congregants, again, have written for those. And so you can sign up for those online, and there'll also be a limited number of printed versions of that too. So one of the things that I had already put into the deck for today is the first cartoon we're going to see, or a cartoon that we're going to show here. Somewhat of a joke, but somewhat serious here. Some of you are familiar with this cartoon. Lucy and Linus and Charlie Brown are out lying in a field. And first of all, it says, Lucy asks, if you use your imagination, you can see lots of things in cloud formations. What do you think you see, Linus? Well, those clouds up there look to me like the map of the British Honduras on the Caribbean. And that cloud over there looks a little like the profile of Thomas Ekin, the famous painter and sculptor. And that group of clouds over there give me the impression of the stoning of Stephen. I can see the Apostle Paul standing there to one side. Well, that's very good. What do you think you see, Charlie, in the clouds, Charlie Brown? Well, I was going to say I saw a ducky and a horsey, but I changed my mind. That's obviously from the 60s, and it kind of sets the tone for our study today for me. Every time I read a miracle in the scriptures, like the Transfiguration, which we're going to talk about today, I sometimes feel like Charlie Brown looking at the clouds. It's just almost more than my human mind can comprehend, but yet it's because of faith that I can take that to heart. There's also times when my faith feels kind of mundane, I guess you could call it, in light of that kind of thing. But even that doesn't hold back the miracle that has taken place. And so, but the other thing is for me, is when I get to visit these locations where the traditional site of these miracles are, it really brings it to life, but it also keeps me in awe of what has happened in our world and what Christ has done for us. It tugs at my heart. It begins to pull on my soul, so to speak. And so I every year, as I was reading this the other day, I began to visualize and to feel and to think and long to be in that place again. So hopefully that'll happen not too many years from now. We can do that again. I do want to show a couple of slides here that can get us started. The first one again is a map. I believe I put that in order. We're going to come back to the scripture with that, but you can see the map here. And if you remember, Caesarea Philippi and Mount Hermon are up there in the northern part of the slide. For those of you here in the room, that's Caesarea Philippi there. That's Mount Hermon or Mount Hermon there. And then heading south from that, past the Sea of Galilee, in the Jezreel Valley over here, you'll see Mount Tabor. And those are the two traditional sites, or the two sites that are most likely for most scholars and most individuals that this transfiguration story takes place. In the next slide, we can see this is Mount Hermon. This is 35 miles. We're on the Sea of Galilee right now when I took this picture. The Mount Hermon is 9,000 feet tall, and it is up here 35 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. So you can see it's a very ominous and very overwhelming sight, but it is snow covered a good bit of the year, not all year. But you can see this is down at the bottom left. You'll see the chapel at Capernaum there. So this is on the Sea of Galilee. There you go. My batteries just ran out on this. And then the next picture is one of the things that I kind of envision what this might have been like, this transfiguration of being on Mount Hermon, and you can be there and you can see the snow is all around. It's glistening white. Some of you have been in whiteouts before, where you really can't see anything in front of you. It's just brilliantly white with that, and you can see the cloud resting on the top of Mount Hermon. And this is kind of the dramatic picture for me of what this might have looked like and been. And then the final picture there is Mount Tabor, which I mentioned to you is in Jezreel Valley. This kind of sticks up out of the Jezreel Valley somewhat like Stone Mountain does for us. It's not that it's in a major mountain range, but it's just kind of there by itself. And historically, traditionally, there is a lot of feeling that this is the location too. And based on the story we're going to read in a minute, it makes a little bit of sense for both of them as an option. But again, it's not so much the place that's the issue, as much it is what happened there. And there is, of course, a chapel on the top of Mount Tabor to the Mount Transfiguration, as they call it. And so I want to go back to the scripture, if you would, Mark. Today we're in the Gospel of Mark, the 9th chapter, the 2nd through the 9th verses. It says, 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. And then it kind of goes into the next story, but it leads us in with that. And as they were coming down from the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. Now, I think it's helpful, as Matt often reminds us, it's helpful to know what's on the beginning and the ending of this story, and to really put into context what we're talking about. In chapter 8, we begin with the feeding of the 4,000, and the feeding of the 5,000 is in Mark 6. So Mark 6 has already experienced the feeding of the 5,000, which was near Bethsaida, on the Jewish side of the Galilee. And in this story, in chapter 8, then, 2 chapters later, we have the feeding of the 4,000, which took place on the other side, on the Gentile side. And remember, on the other side is really on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. And then we have a demand for a sign. The Pharisees want proof that Jesus is who he says he is. And so they try again to get Jesus to commit to making a blasphemous statement. And Jesus, interestingly, in this case, doesn't even do anything. He just walks away, which I think is a great thing. And then we have the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. And it is the bread of God. If you remember, Jesus asked him about bread, and the disciples are having a tough time understanding what he's meaning. But it's the bread of God that comes through Jesus that feeds people, not the yeast that is earthly bound, that the Pharisees and the Sadducees seek to be. And Jesus asked the disciples, do you still not perceive or understand? We've got this continuing story in the Gospels, where, especially in the Gospel of Mark, where the continuing statement is, and they did not understand. Or they were amazed and they did not understand. And that was true for the disciples too. They've been with him for all this time in his ministry, yet they're surprised at the things that happen. And then this really begins, this next part of this really begins kind of what's the front end of a bookend that we're going to see of healing stories. This one is Jesus cures a blind man at Bethsaida. And that's in the 8th chapter, the 22nd through the 26th verses. And if you continue to read this line all the way through to the 10th chapter, at the end of that, there's the healing of blind Bartimaeus. So we have these two healing stories that take place that put into it all of this that we're going to talk about. And this is a number of healings and miracles that take place during this. But these two healings in particular are the ones that are called the bookends of this particular passage and story. So Jesus, if you remember, the man has been blind. His friends bring him to Jesus. Jesus spits on his hands and rubs it on the guy's eyes. And he asks him if he can see. And he says, yeah, I can see, but everybody looks like trees. And so he does it again. He rubs his eyes again, and then he's able to fully see. And so the interesting thing about this is that these healing stories begin to have with people who can then begin to see, but throughout this passage, the disciples still don't get it. They're still blinded by their lack of faith or their lack of knowledge at that point. And then Peter declares about Jesus. If you remember, Jesus goes to Caesarea Philippi, this very pagan place, and he says to the disciples, who do the people say that I am? And ultimately, Jesus says, Peter says, you are the Messiah. And then he sternly tells the disciples, don't tell anyone. The time is not right. But we have this miraculous experience on the Caesarea Philippi, which is right at the foot, remember, of Mount Hermon. And then Jesus foretells his death and resurrection. Jesus says he must suffer and die. And again, Peter rebukes him and says, no way, Lord. No way can this happen. And then he says, again, get behind me, Satan. You're holding me back. Don't hold me back. Allow me to be the blessed one. And if you follow me, he also tells the disciple, you know, to just deny yourselves and follow me. And so in the very first verse then of the 9th chapter, which is what I added on, or we had in that particular passage, is that Peter, James, and John are the ones that really won't die before they see the coming of the kingdom. So if you remember in that verse, in the first verse of the 9th chapter, it's about, there are people here who will see the kingdom come before they die. And many people think that points to this transfiguration experience where these three guys go with Jesus up on the mountain. So at this point in time, we're halfway through the Gospel of Matthew. Gospel of Matthew is 16 chapters long. Here we are in the 8th and 9th chapters with that. And there's two major events that happen during this time period. And one is Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi, and the other, obviously, is, and it's after that they really kind of begin the journey. For me, this is the beginning of moving toward Holy Week. It's at Caesarea Philippi that Peter proclaims this, and Jesus says, okay, I'm setting my sights on Jerusalem. And so from this point on, he's heading south. And that's why some people think that this is Mount Tabor is kind of 60 miles south of where they are right now. And so it says 6 days later. in the scriptures. And so 6 days later, either they've been hanging around up near Caesarea Philippi where Mount Hermon is, which is the most high mountain in that whole region. So if you read the scriptures and it says they went to a very high mountain, that one makes sense. But if you're heading south and you come to Mount Tabor, then you also see that as kind of a sticking up like Stone Mountain. It's a high mountain because there's not as many mountains around that. And so the Transfiguration is the other story that takes place. And I think for Jesus, this is one of those things, seeing is believing. He's taking these three guys with him up on the mountain to witness his full raiment as the Son of God with that. And it's one of those things, you ever had a story you needed to tell somebody and you just said, oh, you just needed to be there. If it's just so magnificent, you just need to be there. I wish you could have been there, is what we often say to people. And what Jesus is doing is giving them an opportunity to have a glimpse of who he really is as the Messiah. So seeing is believing, and Jesus will allow them to see so that they no longer doubt. At least that's what his hope is. That's what his prayer is, that they will see and they will believe with that. And there's no obstacles, there's no obstructions, there's no darkness. This is truly a light. Jesus becomes the light. He glows, is what it amounts to. He is so white that there's no doubt this is who he is. So they see with their own eyes the Son of Man. And the disciples then followed Jesus for 3 years, but again, they still had doubts with that. So as we look at the scripture passage, then, as I mentioned, we are 6 days later from where Peter's confession is on Caesarea Philippi. And Jesus took with him Peter, who is the oldest disciple. He takes James, who is the youngest disciple. And then he takes John, who is James' older brother. And he takes them up on the mountain and led them up to a high mountain apart. But it doesn't tell us again which mountain. By themselves. And he was transfigured or transformed. That takes place. He's revealed as the Son of God. The interesting thing is for us is the Greek word that is used to describe this transformation is the word that it comes from the word we call metamorphosis. So there is a change that takes place in Jesus at this point. And so it is revealed before them, and his clothes become dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to him Elijah, who is the chief prophet of God, with Moses, who is the lawgiver of God, who is talking with Jesus, the Son of God. So you have the triad here that have gathered. The most pinnacle people in the faith at this point are these three. And so, interestingly, there's always been lots of conversation about why Elijah is listed first. Moses is really the pinnacle person. So why is it Moses? He's got seniority. He's got he's more prominent. He's more famous. All those kinds of things. Why is Elijah put here first? And there's of course volumes written on thoughts about that. Interestingly, too, is that Matthew and Luke, who follow the Markian text here, flip it so that Moses is listed first. So not sure why Mark felt that it was important to put Elijah first with that. So Jesus brought the three disciples to validate that he is the Son of God. Biblically, if you ever had a question about things or you want it documented or validated, you would bring people to watch. You would bring people to see. You would bring people to hear. And so Jesus has got these three guys with him who are going to validate that he is the Son of God. But interestingly, he says, oops, don't tell anybody. You come here and experience it and see it and be a part of it, but hold on to that right now. Wait until I'm no longer here to proclaim that word. And of course, we'll see what happens later on as we go down that. But Jesus, interestingly, this holy thing experiences there is so bright, it is unbelievable. It is undeniable that this has happened. And so they take that with them. And Jesus is not the lawgiver. That's what Moses is. He is the very word of God. He is not the prophet, which Elijah is. He is the promised Messiah of all the prophets. And so he is veiled in human flesh to people before this, but now he reveals himself as truly divinity with this. And these three guys get to experience this. In essence, Moses and Elijah, I think symbolically give their permission, give their endorsement of Jesus for this very important role that Jesus has. Then Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, or shrines, or temples, or booths, or tents. Basically, let's live here. This is great. Let's live here. Let's be here together. And won't it be great for all of us to stay here? One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. But it all goes on to say, but he said that because he really didn't know what else to say. He is so overwhelmed and surprised by this. He doesn't know, it says, for they were terrified. And the interesting thing, again, is the Greek word that is used here is the same word that is used for the shepherds in the field. They were sore afraid. And here's these guys that have been with Jesus all this time, but in this particular moment, they are overwhelmed by this. And so they have the experience. So he didn't know what to say. Then a cloud, a glory cloud, overshadowed them. And from the cloud, there came a voice. This is my son, which is the same phrase that we hear when Jesus was baptized by John. The beloved, listen to him. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and the prophecy at this point. So again, you've got the leaders of law and prophecy who are there with them. And Jesus then becomes the one who is the authority. God is again ordained him, has verified him to be this. And suddenly when they looked around, they saw no one with them, but only Jesus. It's interesting to see in this story, Jesus doesn't speak. The transformation takes place without Jesus proclaiming anything. He talks to Moses and Elijah, which the disciples don't hear, but he does all this. Glory is revealed even in that moment. And then we move on to the coming of Elijah. It leads into this next. And it says, as they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus, ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. And we'll continue to see this play out until we get to Jerusalem. And, you'll hear Jesus say later on, that I can't make these people be quiet because if they did not proclaim it, even the rocks would proclaim that I am the Messiah. And so we're still waiting for that dramatic scene to take place in Jerusalem. So this is the story we've talked about today. And then again, looking at the backside of the story, in the rest of the chapter, of the 9th chapter, we have this thing that goes into immediately. And this is what's one of those wonderful things. We have mountaintop experiences in our lives, but Jesus says, we can't stay up here. We can't build booths. We can't build houses. We need to go back down. And if you remember, the other disciples are at the bottom of the mountain. They're at the bottom of this high place. They are continuing to try to do the ministry. And so what happens is the first thing that happens if Jesus comes down, there's an argument at the bottom of the mountain. There's an argument about the disciples arguing among themselves and the people because this man brought a child to be healed by Jesus. And the disciples have tried their best to heal as a representative of Jesus, but it just hasn't worked. And so the disciples who stayed at what we call the base of the mountain were trying to heal, but they couldn't figure out why it wasn't working. And this little boy has a spirit that has made it unable for him to speak. And so Jesus basically says to the father, tell me your story. And he does. I brought him to see you. And he says, I believe, help my unbelief, Jesus. And so Jesus at that point heals the little boy. And then he says to the disciple, here's the reason you couldn't do this. is because, first of all, you didn't really have enough faith. And second of all, this particular spirit took you praying for it to leave. And you didn't pray. How many times in our lives when we've experienced things that's the last thing that we do? We don't pray. We don't really go to God with this. We try to figure it out on our own. And that's what's happening with the disciples. They're trying to figure out in their humanness how to heal this person. As a representative of Jesus Christ, they're doing their best. But the reality is they just can't quite do it. They can't quite do it because they haven't fully been able to see. They're still blind, it would be as such. And so the next story after that is Jesus again foretells his death and his resurrection. And it says the disciples did not understand. Jesus tells them again, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to be killed. And here's what's going to happen. I'm going to be raised from the dead. And the disciples listened to it, but it says in the scriptures they didn't ask any questions because they were afraid. They didn't ask about it. They didn't say, well, tell us more. They just said, oh, okay. But they really didn't fully understand once again. They did not understand because they were afraid to ask. And then it comes to the argument about who's going to be the greatest. And this is one of those stories that keeps coming up about who's going to sit with Jesus when he goes to heaven. Who's going to sit with Jesus and as part of the throne? And so they're arguing over who's going to be the greatest. And Jesus kind of hears this stuff going on in the background. And he says, but to be first, you've got to be last. Don't talk about who's going to sit beside me. Don't talk to me about who's going to go to the top of the mountain with me. Who's going to do the work at the bottom of the mountain? And that's how you become great in the midst of that. And whoever welcomes such as a child of this welcomes people in my name. So if you treat people as God has called you to treat children and adults, all those around us, then you will do it in my name. And then recognizing your aliens, or your allies, rather, not your aliens. Allies. There's another exorcist going on here. There's people who are healing people in the name of Jesus, but they're not one of us. They're not one of your disciples, Jesus. Someone else is casting out demons. So the disciples say, you can't do that. That's our job, even though we just weren't able to do it. That's our job. We're a part of this special group of people, but you can't do it. And of course, Jesus says, whoever is not against us is for us. Whoever's doing things in my name, even if they aren't fully disciples of mine yet, if they're doing it, let's see what can happen with that to further my kingdom. And then the final part of this chapter 9 is the temptations to sin. Don't be a stumbling block to these little ones. And I can imagine Jesus just pulling that child over and say, don't be a stumbling block to this child. Be an example. And that's what we do as a church. When a child is baptized here, what's the thing we say? Is that we as a church are going to be responsible for the upbringing of this child. We're going to support the parents. We're going to provide all this child needs to be a faithful follower of Jesus Christ. And so for that reason, don't be a stumbling block. Don't hold them back. But if you do hold them back, then you might as well put a millstone around your neck and be cast into the Sea of Galilee, because you're not fully living out the faith as I would call you to. So anyway, that's chapters 8 and 9, but really focusing in on this transfiguration. Phil's got some great stuff for the sermon this Sunday, and I tried not to walk on anything he's going to share with you on that. So just look forward to that. I think what he's going to have is really good stuff for you. So I hope you'll have a chance to do that. So we do have a few questions. So Mark, if you can put those up for folks online, and there's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. So you can do 2 groups of 7 if you want, or you can do whatever you want to do in smaller groups.